Hi everyone! Today I'm going to take you through how to paint this sparkly tree fantasy landscape. This painting was completely intuitive, which means I made some shapes and patterns on the canvas, and then I let those shapes and patterns guide me as to what kind of features I would put in the painting. So hopefully you'll have a lot of fun doing this one, and I'll tell you what you need in just a moment. All right, here's a lot of the colors I've been using lately. I do use a lot of neon paints in my paintings, and I will take you through which colors I use and how I've mixed them as we go. You're also going to need a variety of brushes. I used a lot of different flat brushes in this one, as well as a large, that brush at the bottom, the one that says 50, that large round brush. I use that for the background. I use that top brush with the red handle. I use that a lot as well in this painting. And you're also going to need 2 pots of water so you can keep your brushes nice and clean between colors, especially if you're using things like white or yellow. You don't want them to mix in with other colors. You want them to be vibrant. All right, I've started with a black canvas. You can just paint a canvas black if you like. Or you can actually purchase canvases that are black. I started with a black canvas because I wanted some depth, and the black gives you that immediate depth and shadow. I've placed a neon lime green in the middle and a turquoise blue in the middle. As you can see, I'm just sort of streaking it on. You can, if you're working on a table rather than having your canvas upright like I do, you can just put your paint straight on the canvas and then start painting around. And what I've done is just create some swirls. So I've used the turquoise, the lime green, and a aqua blue color around the edges. And I'm building up the colors. So I've started with 2 colors, and then I've added some yellow in the middle. And you'll see me just layering everything. Now this process is actually really enjoyable because there's no right or wrong. Your swirls might look different. Your colors might be slightly different to mine. Now I'm adding some orange to go with that yellow and the green. They're all warm colors, so they tend to go nicely together. The blue colors are the cool colors. Just use your instincts. I'm left-handed as well, so the way that I do my swirls might be slightly different. If you're right-handed, you might do it differently. And I'm just creating lines and shapes. Now I've added some neon pink as well as some neon orange, and I'm just creating waves. This process can take 10 minutes, it can take 20 minutes. I spend a lot of time doing this because I was just enjoying the process, and it's quite fun and liberating. Now I'm adding in some white, and I'm using a dry brush to blend it in a little bit, and then we'll just layer it again and make it a little bit more prominent and get them to blend in. You want to be able to see all of those different colors, but you also want them to be cohesive together. Adding back in some more blue. Now the neon paints that I have tend to be a little bit transparent, especially when you're starting on a dark black canvas like I have. Depending on what kind of acrylic paints you use, if you purchase some heavy bodied acrylic paints, you'll find that the coverage is a lot better. Otherwise, acrylics do tend to dry quickly, so I'm just sort of layering them as we go. This aqua blue color is also a metallic color. I know you can't really see it here maybe you can't see it on the camera, but it is a sort of a metallic blue, and it's used for waves, and it's an aqua blue. Now I'm just starting to create shapes. I'm trying to follow the initial lines that I made, as well as doing wider squiggles and shorter squiggles and ones that are more close together. You can see that I'm sort of building up the color. So there is color that has faded or is a little bit transparent. Especially neons, as they dry, they tend to get a little bit darker. So it's good to layer everything so it's nice and vibrant. As I started layering these on the left hand side, I sort of envisioned a tree. You'll notice with my paintings, because I'm sort of reaching from the side so that you can see what I'm doing, I find that a lot of my more detailed work is usually on the left side of the painting, where I can reach over and I can see a little bit better. If you wanted to place a tree on the right, or if your patterns tell you that your tree or your foliage should be somewhere else, you can certainly do it on the other side. I just started to envisage a tree on the left side, because it has, if we look at those white waves, it started to look a little bit like a trunk to me. And then the green and the turquoise started to look like water, which is where the finished product ended up finishing off. Now you can see how these are starting to blend together a little bit more, and we still have some of that depth in the background. You can still see some of those shadows. I'm just trying to, anywhere where there are some spaces, or I feel like it's a bit too faded, or I want them to blend in more. And with acrylics, they tend to dry quickly, so I'm also wetting my brush and using my brush to blend them in while they're still wet, or to just replace that moisture. And that also creates a definite line. So with acrylics, if you cut it with a little bit of water, not too much, if you use too much water, then it starts to dribble down and some of the paint starts to come off. But if you use some water and cut it with water, you can also find that you can make your lines a bit sharper. It's always nice when you're trying to do close-up work or detailed work. You get that nice sharp line. I started off by using a big round brush, the one that I pointed out at the beginning, and now I'm using a smaller flat brush. And a flat brush is exactly what it sounds like. It's square and it's thin and it's cut straight across. And the beauty of a flat brush is that you can use it horizontally or vertically. So if you use it vertically, you tend to get that sharp line. If you use it horizontally, you can get more coverage. So sometimes I'm using the flat brush horizontally and placing more pressure, so that just like I'm doing with that yellow now, so that we get those bigger sweeps. And then if you turn it sideways and use it horizontally, you can get sharper, thinner lines. You can stop when you feel like all of your swirls are blended in together and you've got some different colors that are distinct from one another. Now what I'm doing is I'm painting in the light source. So I want the light source to come from the right side, and I'm going to do some rays as well. So I started with some cool yellow and some white, not neon yellow, just cool yellow and some white. And the brightest part of that light should be the white bit, and the softer, warmer parts should be the yellow bit. I'm using a large brush. It's sort of a triangular shape to do the rays of light. Now I felt like I had a few too many, although they were too thick. The wonderful thing with acrylics is once that background dried, I actually dried it with a hairdryer to make sure it was completely dry before I did those sun rays. So make sure that yours is completely dry before you do that, because otherwise your paint might bleed into the different colors in the background. And I have some baby wipes handy. So if there's something that I don't like, or that I want to change, or if I feel like I've been too heavy-handed, it's actually quite easy to grab some wipes and wipe some of it off. Now on the left side, I've used some burnt umber mixed with some cool red to create the color of the trunk. Now I'm using some black to get that shadow in on the left side. This is my birdie. His name is Yoshi, and he makes an appearance in all my videos because he loves to hang out with me when I'm painting. Sometimes he tries to eat the brushes, so I have to put him back into his house, but for now he's being a good boy, so he's hanging out with me a little bit. So what I'm doing here is building up the trunk and the branches. Because our light source is on the right side and the rays are coming from the right side, the darkest part of the tree will be the very left part of the canvas, because that's where the shadows sort of sit. I'm using brown, and I'm using that burnt umber with some red mixed into it and some black. So underneath the branches, or rather on top of the branches, where they're furthest away from the light, I've tried to create some shadows. And then I've used the burnt umber and the red to create a few more highlights. Make sure your branches, all the branches should be growing out because they do grow towards the light, but they're not uniform. So you want some short, some long, some sticking up in different directions. I wanted to put some foliage on this tree to jazz it up a little bit, give it a bit of character. I've just dipped one of my shabby brushes that I use a lot for clouds and I use a lot for stippling. So if you have a shabby brush, it's always nice. Now I'm using my flat brush again. I've mixed in some green, some sap green with some cool yellow, and that has created that nice grassy, mossy green color. Just adding a few highlights to the branches with that same mossy green. I'm using a flat brush for that. I felt like, and I was just dabbing. So using a flat brush and dabbing left and right, up and down, creates that nice texture on the tree. Same thing here. I've mixed some neon green with some white. That's our highlights. So the highlights that you can see that are the brightest are the ones that are closest to the light source. I'm just finishing off those highlights on the tree. Then we're going to move on to do the leaves, the undercoat of the leaves. Mixing in some of that darker green. Just building up those layers. So building up some of that darker green, again using the flat brush and just dabbing and tapping to create that texture. And then using the lightest color on the right of the tree because that's where the light is hitting it. Now I'm using my stipple brush and I have mixed some cool red in with some of that burnt umber. You want a deep backdrop color because if you don't have a deep color, then you kind of have nowhere to go with your highlights. So while it looks quite dark now, once we layer it with some red and then we put some pink highlights on it, then it'll really start to come to life. I wanted a sort of weeping willow look. So I'm using my stipple brush and dabbing and tapping to create the leaves, but then I also want some of the leaves to hang down. Now I'm going over it with cool red. Nothing mixed in with it, just cool red, vibrant red. And I'm trying to leave some of those shadows or that darker red, the red and the burnt umber that is underneath because that's what creates the shadow and the depth of the tree. Also trying to leave some of the background in as well, just being able to see through those branches is really nice. And then at the end, just pulling and flicking down to create that weeping willow look. Now I've mixed some cool red in with some white to create a pink color and a little bit of neon pink, I believe. And now that creates our third layer that's a little bit brighter. And I'm using a small flat brush and I'm using it vertically to create sharper lines, just to create lines that look a little bit more prominent, that are drooping down. Trying to do that where I think maybe the ends of the branches would be. Just use your instincts with this. Try not to go overboard because you want to see the different layer of colors that you've put underneath, and you still want to see some of the background so you can sort of see through the tree. We want to be able to see those layers. That's what gives us that nice perspective of seeing the background, the middle ground, and the foreground. Now going in with some white mixed with a tiny, tiny bit of neon pink, mostly white, just to create those last highlights. And I'm trying to put those highlights closer to where I think the light source is, or where the light would be hitting it. So you can see that you can see some of that dark red, you can see some of the pink, some of the red, and then some of that really bright highlight. On the tree over the foliage, I have just added some neon orange and then dipped my brush in, left my brush dirty and dipped it into some of that lime green just so that we can blend it in a little bit more, and that's sort of some I guess some flowers or some foliage growing on the tree. Now, the other thing I started to envisage was some kind of pathway or some kind of hill. So I'm building that up now. I'm using neon green and white, and then you'll find I am going in with some shadows. So the closer that pathway or that hill is to us, the darker the green will be. So I'm filling in the darker green now, and I'm using that same green that I mixed in for the tree trunk. Some sap green, a little tiny bit of burnt umber, and then a little bit of yellow as well. Just building up those layers, leaving some highlights at the top. Now I've used white and a tiny bit of sap green. That gives us our highlights. So I'm trying to make it brighter at the top of the hill because that's further away from us and closer to the light. And now building up the top of that. I wanted to paint in a little house or a little cottage later on. So I'm building up that hill now. So brighter at the top. And then as we get closer to the bottom of our hill or further down on our hill, it becomes darker. I'm using a flat brush here and using it horizontally and just painting left and right. Depending on if I want some sharp lines or if I want a little bit more coverage, I'll just move my flat brush around. So I'll move it around to create those sharp lines on the edge of the hill, and then to blend in the grass to the highlights and make sure that it fades nicely, I will change the positioning of my brush. Now it's getting a little bit darker because we're further away from the top of the hill or the pathway. I left that little section underneath blue because then I started to envisage, I thought maybe there would be a little bit of water, which is where our waterfalls will come from in just a moment. This process is really fun. I chose my biggest brush that has the largest handle, and I'm just dipping it into white paint and using the end to dab some little circles. These are going to be the beginnings of our little flowers or lights or sparkles on the tree. This is a bit of a fantasy painting, so it doesn't necessarily have to look realistic and you can have some fun with it. I'm doing this now because I want the white to dry. Then we can choose what color highlights or what color we would like. I will probably do, I think I wanted to do yellow, and I ended up using neon yellow to create some highlights. Now I've grabbed a smaller brush with a smaller end and dabbing a few smaller dots. I want them to be different sizes. So if we do this now and we continue with the rest of the painting, then by the time we get to the end of it, then they will be dry and we'll be able to put our highlights on. I tried to put some of the smaller ones closer to the drooping parts of the tree, and then the larger dots I put in at the top of the tree or the bigger part of the tree. I thought those little droopy bits should be a little bit more delicate, so I used smaller dots. Now I'm building up our cliff. I am using burnt umber and red again, using a small stipple brush to create the texture of the rock. I've built it up to create 3 little levels. Now I'm doing some shadow underneath the rock. The light source would probably be hitting the top, not the bottom, creating some depth. That was just black, just using black. Now I'm using some neon orange to create some points of that light would be hitting it. You have to build this up because I'm putting neon orange on a darker color. So you'll see me layering it until I can start to see those textures forming. We can start to see them now a little bit. So on the little tops of those rocks or those cliffs is brighter because that's where the light is hitting it. Or at the tips. You can start to see that texture and shape of that rock forming. And I've created those little points so that our little waterfalls have somewhere to drop. Last but not least, going in with some cool yellow, not neon yellow, just cool yellow. Just so that we can see the edge of the rocks that little bit more clearly. It's a nice contrast to the blue background that is there. Now I'm using a fan brush. If you don't have a fan brush, you could probably use a flat brush to do this, but I'm using a fan brush and just sweeping it to the side and then pulling down, sweeping to the side and then pulling down. And it creates that effect of water. I'm only using turquoise at the moment, and then I'm going to use white to create highlights. Generally, you will find that there will be more white at the top of the waterfall. That's where it's rushing down, and then at the bottom where there's some little splashes. So now I'm doing those highlights with the fan brush again, washing my brush between every use because we want the white to be nice and bright, creating a few little splashes down the bottom of where the water's hitting. Now I am building up that little river of water using some of the aqua blue, some of the turquoise, and then highlighting it with white. I've highlighted the top so we can see it sort of looks like it's cascading down some little hills. So the top of those I have highlighted because they're the top part where more light will hit. And then I've tried to create some shadow in between each one of those little bumps. Up the top where the water is rushing the quickest, I've added some more highlights. Then making sure that that white highlight right at the top is nice and bright. And then blending it into the little body of water down the bottom. Just doing some final shadows right at the bottom of the hill. That's where the least light is going to be hitting. Using some red here just to create a more vibrant base for our foliage at the front. I'm just using cool yellow, nothing else, just cool yellow, not really mixed in with anything. I'm using a small stipple brush. Using my fan brush again with that sap green mixed with the yellow. And I am creating some grass, and we're also going to draw in a few details of the flowers. This is the foreground, so we can see some more detail. Now I'm using some neon green for highlights. We can see those blades nice and clearly and those stems for the flowers nice and clearly. Just in between each one of those little hills. Now I'm using neon pink. And just creating little flicks to create flowers. Now I've tried to make sure that I don't make all the flowers look the same and they're not all on the same level. Some are lower, some are higher. Vary it a little bit. Now I'm doing a few more highlights. Now that it's all dry, I'm doing a few more highlights on my light source. Just trying to get it to blend in. Fill in some of those gaps at the top, just with some white. Now we're going to draw in our house or paint in our house. Starting with the roof. I just do an outline for how big I want it and where I want it and what I want the roof to look like, what I want the walls to look like. Then I will add in some highlights. The darker part of the house will be the walls and the bottom of the roof, and the brightest part will be the top because that's where the light is hitting it. I'm trying to use a few different colors that I've already used within the painting, which will tie it all in together. I use some blue, I use some burnt umber, I use a little bit of red, some white, and then when I paint in the windows, I use some yellow, so there's some nice warm light coming out of the little cottage or the house. You can see me building up some of those layers there. Little bit of red, a little bit of burnt umber, a little bit of blue, I'm just using the colors that are already on my palette. Then if I want some highlights, I'll mix in some white. Mixed in some blue. So mixing it in with some of that blue that's in the background also makes it look like it's further away from us, that it's sort of blending into those background colors. I've done two little, I wanted it to look like, I wanted the house to have a little section at the front. So we've got that larger portion of the house on the left, and then almost like a little side room that's in the center. You can see that I've done another little roof. Now I'm just giving it its last few highlights, the top of the house, the edges, and then we'll paint in some windows. Because this is in the background, you don't need to do the details. We won't be able to see the details properly because it is in the background. So you don't have to worry too much about getting all of the angles perfectly straight or all of the details exactly right. Now I'm just using a cool yellow to paint in the windows. And you can see I haven't done any shading or anything. It's just that some of the paint is still wet, so it's blending in. I've tried to keep the top of the windows the brightest and then the bottom of the windows a little bit darker. Just doing some final touches there. So you can see that I have made the roof brown and then it fades up to white. Now our house needs something to sit on, so I have added in some more highlights just to make it look like it's part of that hill. I'm using cool yellow, mixing it in with a tiny bit of green, and I also thought because the house has some yellow light coming out of it, it's fitting that the light would hit on the ground that's around it, so it ties in and corresponds, aligns quite nicely. Just trying to make those windows stand out a little bit more so we can see a little bit of detail. I'm just using black there. Black and then going over it with a little bit of white. Now I'm adding in a few final touches just with white, and I am using a round brush with a pointed tip to do those little flicks. Now I'm using my fan brush again. I'm using a light pink here. So pink, I've used a light pink color and mixed in some white. The further away something is, the less detail there is. So I'm just using a very soft fan brush and flicking very lightly, not putting much pressure onto the canvas. And again, the tops of the hills are where I've put those highlights, rather than the depths between those little hilly bits, because the depths aren't going to have as many highlights. I wanted to put something near our waterfall, so I'm building up, I guess what looks like a pine tree. I've started with some light pink. Then I'm going to go in with some shadow and some neon pink. So you can see I've sort of done a zigzag. So to do a tree like this, you can start at the top or the bottom, up to you. If you start at the top, you do small little dabs with your fan brush and you sort of zigzag it left to right, and pull your hand down as you are dabbing and tapping left and right. Creates a bit of a zigzag effect. And that sort of tells us that this tree isn't quite in the foreground. It's probably mid-ground. It's not completely in the background because we can see some of the details, but it's not quite as close as our sparkly tree in the front. Then I've just gone in with some white mixed in with a tiny little bit of neon pink just to create those last highlights. And I wanted to be able to see some branches. I thought it needed just a little bit more detail. I'm going in with some burnt umber mixed in with a little bit of black Just using a round brush with a pointed tip, quite a thin one, and going in and making some squiggly lines to paint in our branches. Because it is further away than our sparkly tree at the front, the trunk is thinner and the branches are thinner and lighter as well. Putting in those last couple of details in the flowers, just little dots, just burnt umber. Now what I'm doing is I'm using a round brush with a pointed tip, and I'm not colouring in all of the circles with the neon yellow. I'm only colouring in the left side of each one of those, and I've left the right side white. And this is because I wanted some bright yellow to contrast and complement the red and pinks that we used in the tree. But I still want these dots, these sparkles, to have some kind of highlight. I didn't want them just to be yellow. So if you look closely, you'll be able to see that the left side, I'm just painting the left side with the neon yellow, and it's lovely and vibrant because we've started with that white. And if you wanted to leave your tree like this, if you like the way it looks, you can leave it. I wanted to do a few more yellow highlights just to tie it all in together. I'm using same neon yellow. And then if you feel like your tree cannot get any sparkly or any brighter, you can definitely leave it there. However, what I'm going to do is actually create, using a round brush with a pointed tip, a very thin one. Now I'm creating some sparkly, shiny bits. Nowhere in particular, just trying to do them at random, and you don't need to do this on all of them. I suppose the trick here to make it look shiny is that the top and the bottom need to be the longest flick. So just loading up my brush with white, starting with the top and the bottom, and the top and the bottom and the two on the left and the right. So when you make a cross, they need to be the longest, the top and the bottom, the left and the right. And then the other ones in between can be a little bit shorter. So see that the top, so I'm doing the tops and the bottom and the sides first, and then filling in a few little flicks. This is definitely optional. So if you feel like your tree is sparkly enough, you don't have to do this, but it's just a little detail that I wanted to do. You can see I made one too long, so I just wiped it off. Or too thick. I felt like this painting was a bit lonely. I felt like a couple of people needed to live in that cabin. So I'm just drawing in some little figures, just using black. 2 little figures holding hands. Maybe they're going for a stroll down to see the waterfall. Then I added just some white highlights on where the light is hitting them. I wanted to add a couple more details. I'm using neon pink here to create little flowers that are growing on the trunk of the tree. Using that same round brush with a pointed tip. Now I'm creating some highlights with some white and some light pink. Closest to the light source, so the highlights go on the right. I'm using a baby wipe just to get some of those. So I've gone over that. I've gone over my sun rays. Once everything is dry, please make sure that your painting is completely dry before you do that. And I went over my sun rays so that we've got some of the rays are hitting the mountain, some of the rays are shining through the tree. And to finish off our light source, I added in some neon orange and neon pink. Just on the edges, because the light source needs to be the brightest or the whitest where it's strongest. And there you have it. Completely finished our lovely sparkly fantasy tree landscape. I hope you painted along with me today. If you didn't, that's okay. Thank you for watching. If you're still watching at this point, thank you so much for supporting me and watching my tutorials. If you have any recommendations or requests, let me know. Otherwise, I will bring you a tutorial as soon as possible. Another one will be coming soon. See you later.